Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome to another video and hope you guys are doing well today. Now, we are looking at raid comps. Now, this is going to be something that is wildly important when it comes to Cataclysm, especially in 10 mans. Now, in 25 man, it's not too much of a problem. You're going to be able to fit most, if not all, classes into some form of setup, and you'll get all the buffs and all that good stuff. In 10 man, that's not the case. So we're going to put together a couple of few raid comps for melee cleaves, caster cleaves, and my personal comp that I will be looking for going into Cataclysm. So let's talk about it. Now, this is probably one of the baseline comps for a melee cleave. You have the Blood DK and the Feral Tank. I think this is going to be a staple in a lot of different setups, but generally it's going to be quite nice. You then have a Retribution Pally, and in an ideal world, they would also have a protection spec. Now, the reason for this is there's some fights that help if you've got three tanks, especially on progression, and there's some fights that actually having a prop pally is pretty good for as well, like Nefarian. So the Feral being able to flex between tank and cat, the Ret being able to flex between Ret and Prot is pretty good. Now you then have Arms Warrior, which brings Battle Shout, it brings Commanding Shout, it brings Rally, Sunders, Shattering Throw, brings a lot. It also brings a lot of damage. You then have Enhancement Chamois, which brings that Wind Fury Totem, brings Healing Stream or Resistances if needed, and just pumps, basically. It will also bring the 10% attack power buff for everyone, which means that the Blood DK doesn't have to run that talent. So I think this is a pretty good setup. You then have the Disc and Holy. You bring the Disc, gives you the stamina buff. Also, this comp is going to absolutely tear through bosses, which means having a Disc Priest that can actually throw some extra damage out there, perfect. You then got the Holy Pally that will be the core of the healing team. The Holy Pally will be the one doing the heavy lifting when it comes to the healing team. And 3 spots left. Now, for me, I would be looking at something like an Assassination Rogue, or just a Rogue in general, maybe one that can flex between like Combat and Assassination, or Assassination Sub. I would then be looking at some form of Hunter, probably Survival. Brings that replenishment buff, very important. And then after that, you've got a couple of choices. I mean, you could throw a Shadow Priest in, you could throw a Demo Warlock in, you could throw a Fire Mage, a Boomkin, a Unholy DK. You can bring quite a lot. I'd probably put a range slot in this. But generally, that first sort of 7 is the raid comp that I'd be looking at as a melee cleave. Now let's go to the caster cleave. Now, for my caster teams in chat, this is the caster cleave that I am so looking forward to playing. This is what I played back in original Firelands. I played the mage in this comp, which is ironically the spot that I would argue is the most flexible. But it just does so much damage, and it all synergizes really, really nicely. You have so much utility in this group. There's a lot of range, which means you aren't worrying about so many mechanics. You just spread out and ignore them. It's great. You still keep that Blood DK, Feral, Retribution setup. And I still do think that having a Feral that can go Kitty and a Ret that can go Prot is going to be amazing. Now, the advantages of this team comp is you have Shadow Priest, which brings a little bit of an additional healing as well. You have a Balanced Druid, which is a different source of combat res, which is really nice, as well as just a lot of pump damage. You have Elemental, which means you have 3 options here if you ever want to 3 heal anything. You would probably run the Resto Druid or Resto Shaman over another Priest, but still you have that option, which is great. And some fights you will absolutely want to do that. As an example, we did Nefarian last night and found that 3 healing made it a joke. You have a Demonology Warlock, which, aside from the fact that they just pump, and I say Demonology, it doesn't have to be Demonology, you do get the buff that Demonology brings from the Elemental Shaman, so you could play Destruction. This isn't set in stone in terms of specs, it's more classes. And then finally, I would bring a Fire Mage here. They bring a lot, they bring burst damage, they bring Time Warp, food, they bring quite a lot to the group. However, you could quite easily drop the Fire Mage here and stick a Rogue in, which brings that kind of a bit of more melee damage, a couple more kicks. The problem with this comp is genuinely going to be interrupts at times. You are going to rely on that Holy Paladin knowing how to interrupt. You are going to rely on your tanks knowing how to interrupt. That Elemental Shaman's got a job on his hands because he's going to have to know how to interrupt and all that good stuff. So it's one of those things that, yeah, I mean, that last slot is a little bit of a flex. You bring the replenishment, you bring the Earth and Moon, so you aren't forced into anything in this slot. There's an argument to say that an Arms Warrior fits really nicely in this comp. He's not going to have all the buffs, so he's definitely not going to be pumping, but Rally, Sunders, just additional help, I suppose. Yeah, more interrupts. So there's an argument to say that you could turn this spot into pretty much whatever suited you. But for me personally, it'd be a Fire Mage and they pump. In terms of the 10-man that I will be looking to try and play in Cataclysm, this is it. Blood DK main tank, Feral off tank with a Retribution Paladin with a Pro off spec. In terms of the healing team, then you have a Holy Paladin, Disc Priest, and an Elemental Shaman that can go resto if it's needed. In terms of then DPS, you have Ret, Ellie, Shadow, Unholy DPS, Survival, and Arms. Now, this setup of teams, while it brings a good amount of interrupts, a good melee range split, it brings all but one buff, two buffs in the game. It just brings the most balance of everything. So let's quickly go through all the buffs and debuffs. So starting from the top, melee speed, you actually have, it comes from the Survival Hunter. The 5% crit comes from Feral Druids and Elemental Shaman. 10% attack power comes from Blood DK. 5% spell haste comes from the Shadow Priest. 10% spell power comes from the Elemental Shaman. 3% all damage comes from the Ret Paladin. 5% of base stats is Druids and Paladins, so we have both. Strength and agility is Horn of Winter from Blood DK. Stamina comes from the Priest. Max mana we actually don't have in this comp. Combat reses, we have 3 classes with combat reses. Bloodlust, we have the Shaman. Plus armor, we have Devotion Aura from one of the Paladins. Resistances, this group can bring pretty much every type of resistance in the game. Replenishment, we have Shadow Priest and Ret Paladins that both can provide it. Major mana cooldowns, we only have 2 Hymn of Hopes and 1 Innovate. We don't actually have a Mana Tide, which is unfortunate, but you can't have everything. MP5, you'll have a Mana Spring Totem or a Blessing of Might from the Paladin. So you bring pretty much every single buff in the game. Now, in terms of debuffs, you have Sunder, which is brought from a Fairy Fire. You have Bleed Damage, which is brought from Mangle. You don't have 5% crit for spells. Now, this is actually really, really, really sad, but there's just no way to fit that Mage or Warlock into this comp, in my opinion. Now, 20% melee haste debuff for bosses, brought by Feral Druids, brought by DKs, so not a problem at all. The 8% magic damage debuff being brought by the Unholy DK. Physical damage debuff brought by the Arms Warrior. Healing debuff on bosses that heal is Arms Warrior again. Physical damage output debuff is brought by Blood DK. And cast speed debuff, if it's absolutely necessary, it can be brought by a DK with Necrotic Slow, but I've never Necrotic Strike, but I'm not sure this is ever something that would be needed. So what do you guys think about my 10-man comp? In terms of 25-man comps, pretty much click every class once and that's what you want. I mean, I can go over a 25-man comp if that's what you'd be interested in. Let me know in the comments below, all that good stuff. Thanks for watching. Bye.